Today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different than what is usually the content of my channel. I want to talk about the holiday of Passover. Passover is beginning right when I'm filming this video. It is beginning tomorrow night, and I want to tell you a little bit about Passover and some ideas I had regarding the holiday. So Passover is the celebration of the Jewish people being freed from the land of Egypt. The Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt for approximately 210 years. They were the slaves of the Egyptians. The Egyptians had seen how the Jewish people were flourishing and the population was growing, and the Egyptians were fearful that the Jewish people would rise up and make war against the Egyptians and that they would take over the land. And the Egyptians were fearful of this, so they made the Jewish people their slaves. They gave them back-breaking work. They treated them really poorly. They had them building with bricks and mortar all of the different buildings in Egypt, and the Jewish people really suffered during this time for 210 years. When God decided it was time to free the Jewish people, to give them their freedom, to bring them to the land of Israel. And God appointed Moses as the leader of the Jewish people to take them out of the land of Egypt. And what followed was it ended up being 10 plagues upon the Egyptian people, because Moses would go to Pharaoh, who was the ruler over the land of Egypt. He would go to Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh to release the Jewish people, and Pharaoh would say no, over and over again 10 times, until finally Pharaoh relented. The Jewish people were set free. The Jewish people started to go into the desert. They crossed, the sea split for them, and they were finally, when they got onto the other side, they achieved their freedom. Not, beforehand, before they crossed the sea, Pharaoh changed his mind, tried to chase the Jewish people, and yet the Jewish people were still able to go free. Where they are now, sort of in these week's Parshas, they're in the desert on their way to the land of Israel. And what's interesting about Passover is that the word Passover comes from the idea of passing over the Jewish people. So when the Jewish people were back in Egypt, when they were enslaved, and when God was getting ready to free them, in this series of 10 plagues, the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn male. So all of the Egyptian firstborn males died. And in order so that the Jewish people wouldn't die, they had to take the blood of a lamb and smear it on their doorposts so that God would know to pass over those houses, because those were the houses of the Jewish people. And so the idea of passing over the Jewish people during a plague is not something new. It is not a foreign concept. It's something that God has done, even going back to this story of Passover in the Torah, where God skipped over the Jewish people during this plague. And God freed us from all of these years of slavery, from all of these years of suffering. God took us out and he freed us, what probably seemed hopeless to the Jewish people at the time, because they were slaves, because they were really treated poorly, because Pharaoh tried to restrict them having children. Pharaoh wanted to kill their babies. All of these horrible, horrible things, and yet God had the power to free them from that. And there have been many times in history where things have seemed hopeless and things have seemed bleak, and yet God has managed to change the situation. We don't understand exactly why things have to happen the way they happen. We don't understand why that there would be suffering, or why there is illness, or why there are bad things that happen in the world. But what we do know is that there is something that we are supposed to learn from it, something we're supposed to gain from it, something that is supposed to change us or shape us as a people because of it, and that God has the ability to save us from whatever the circumstance is. And so we should always remember to have faith in God, that he can rescue us, redeem us, save us from things even when they seem very dark. I also wanted to talk about the Seder plate and some of the ideas we can gain from the different pieces that we put on the Seder plate during the Passover Seder. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the karpas. Karpas is most often seen on the Seder plate in the form of parsley, and it represents how the Jewish people were flourishing. Even though they were slaves in Egypt, even though they were treated so poorly, the population continued to grow and expand and blossom and flourish even during these dark times. And with new life comes a new hope. But at the same time, the Jewish people had fear, because yes, there was new hope with this life, but they were also slaves, and that's a difficult life to raise a family and to bring children into. So with new hope, there were always worries, and that's what we kind of see from the karpas. Then we have the charoset, which is sort of the fruit blend, fruits and nuts sometimes. Different people have different recipes and traditions, but it represents the bricks and mortar that the Jewish people used to build up Egypt. It was their work while they were slaves. Then we have the maror and the chazeret, which represent the bitterness of slavery, the bitterness of our lack of freedom, the bitterness of the time where the Jewish people were at during the Passover story. And, we're supposed to remember the bitterness and remember what it felt like to be slaves in Egypt, remember what that was so that we can really feel the full essence of what it means to be free and what it means to be free people. Then we have the zeroah, which is the shank bone, and it represents the Passover offering that we would bring during the time of the temple. Following the shank bone, we have the egg, or the beitza, and the egg has some different, it's a burnt egg, and it has some different meanings to it as well. It can represent an offering that was brought when we had the temple. It also symbolizes the sadness with the destruction of the temple, and because an egg is round, it represents the life cycle, how you have birth and a whole course of life bringing people to death ultimately in the same life. So it is, again, kind of like the karpas, new hope and sadness and struggle at the same time. The egg is also a reminder that during painful times there is always hope for a future, a brighter future, because again, with the life cycle, things revolve, things change. There's no sort of stagnancy in life. Things are always revolving and changing and continuing. So if things are seeming bad at this time, they will be better in the future. Something else that you will find on the Seder table, but not as part of the Seder plate, is 3 pieces of matzah. So why 3? So 2 of the pieces of matzah represent the sort of what normally would be bread during Sabbath or holidays. So during Shabbat, when the Jewish people were in the desert, Hashem blessed them with manna, and it was a double portion so that they wouldn't have to work for their food during Shabbat. They would have 2 days worth of food, a double portion. And so on Shabbat now, or on holidays now, people use 2 pieces of bread in order to sort of reflect that they got their double portion for Shabbat. So because this is a festival, because Passover is a festival, we have 2 pieces of matzah, and then the 3rd piece of matzah is what you break immediately at the beginning of the Seder. Additionally, there are some other ideas about why 3, including that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob it was in their merits because they were such holy and special people. It was in their merits and because God promised it to them that the Jewish people were taken out of Egypt in the first place. So another thing that's interesting is when we left the desert, when the Jewish people left the desert, the matzah was representing the bread of slaves because they didn't have enough time, they didn't have enough free time to fully make bread. But now, here we are, free people, and now it's sort of the bread of freedom. It's the bread that represents that God took us out of slavery and made us free people. And so if we can remember that whatever circumstances we are in, even when they are dark, that these are temporary circumstances, that things will change, that there is a brighter tomorrow, a brighter future ahead, that is a really great way to remain positive and remain in the spirit of Passover. So I wish you all a wonderful Passover, may be filled with a lot of joy and meaning, and I look forward to touching base back with you guys next week.